The bitter winter evening stretched across an endless expanse of farmland, snow falling steadily from a steel-gray sky. It collected on the shoulders of the empty highway, creating a stark white contrast against the dark asphalt. Calvin's refrigerated truck cut through the desolate landscape, its engine humming steadily against the growing storm. The truck's dashboard showed the outside temperature dropping steadily below -10 degrees Celsius. Calvin had been driving for hours, his eyes fixed on the seemingly endless road ahead. The monotony of the journey was suddenly interrupted by the vibration of his phone against the cup holder. His boss's name flashed on the screen, causing his stomach to tighten. He knew that a call from the boss rarely brought good news, especially on a day like this. With a deep sigh, Calvin answered the call, already anticipating the demands to come. The boss's voice crackled through the speaker, sharp and impatient. "Calvin, we've got 2 urgent deliveries in that cargo you're driving. I need you to step on it. Drive faster." Calvin's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he listened to the details. First, there was a shipment of fresh produce for the distributors. Nothing unusual there. But then came the kicker: wedding flowers, specially requested by the boss's best friend. The boss's tone left no room for excuses or delays as he emphasized repeatedly that the flowers could not be late. "I don't care if you have to drive through a blizzard, Calvin. Those flowers need to be there on time. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Calvin replied, his voice flat and resigned. "I'll make sure it gets done." As the call ended, Calvin's thoughts turned dark. The cab of the truck filled with the sound of his voice as he began ranting to himself. Years of accumulated bitterness spilling out into the confined space. 15 years of this. "Am I the stupidest man alive, or what?" he muttered, gripping the steering wheel even tighter. "Lost my family, my marriage, all to be at the beck and call of a man who couldn't care less about me." His mind wandered to scenarios of growing old alone, imagining himself dying in this very truck seat with no one to notice or care. The thought of how quickly his boss would replace him if illness or accident rendered him unable to drive sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the winter cold outside. "Just another disposable part in the machine," he growled, his words barely audible over the hum of the engine, as if the universe was listening to his complaints and decided to pile on. The gas indicator suddenly blinked on, its red glow adding to Calvin's mounting frustration. "Perfect. Just perfect," he growled, calculating the 20-minute drive to the next station. The farmland stretched endlessly on both sides, the winter wind picking up speed across the open fields. Calvin settled in for the drive, his mood as dark as the storm clouds gathering overhead. As Calvin continued down the highway, the snow began to fall more heavily, reducing visibility with each passing minute. He leaned forward in his seat, squinting through the windshield as the wipers worked overtime to clear the accumulating snow. Suddenly, through the thickening white curtain, Calvin caught a glimpse of something that didn't belong, a splash of pink against the white landscape. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, a result of the monotonous drive and the stress of the day. But as he drew closer, the pink blur began to take shape. To his disbelief, Calvin made out the figure of a young girl, no more than 13 years old, wearing only a thin pink dress that barely reached her knees. She was waving frantically, her entire body trembling violently in the brutal cold. The sight was so incongruous with the desolate winter landscape that for a moment, Calvin wondered if he was hallucinating. As the truck neared the girl, Calvin's foot hovered over the brake pedal. Multiple thoughts raced through his mind, creating a cacophony of conflicting voices in his head. His boss's urgent demands echoed in his ears, reminding him of the tight deadline he was already struggling to meet. Years of experience on the road screamed caution. She could be bait for a trap, a scam, or worse. The cargo deadline loomed large in his consciousness, a constant pressure pushing him forward. "Can't get involved," he muttered, his hand tightening on the steering wheel. "Not my problem. Need to make that delivery." Even as he spoke the words, a part of him rebelled against the coldness of his decision. But the pragmatic, survival-oriented part of his brain, the part that had kept him employed and out of trouble for 15 years, won out. Instead of slowing down, Calvin pressed down on the accelerator in an attempt to drown out his conscience. Calvin deliberately turned up the radio volume. The cab filled with the sounds of an old country song. The singer's twangy voice singing about lost love and loneliness. It seemed a fitting soundtrack to the moment. As he passed the girl, Calvin couldn't help but glance in his rearview mirror. Her small figure grew smaller, but the image burned itself into his mind. Her desperate wave, the thin pink dress whipping in the wind, the visible trembling of her frame. He tried to shake off the guilt that was already beginning to gnaw at him, focusing instead on the road ahead and the job he had to do. But even as the miles stretched between him and the girl in pink, Calvin couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a terrible mistake. The image of her desperate face haunted him, a silent accusation that no amount of radio noise could drown out. After a half-hour drive that felt much longer, the petrol station appeared through the snow like a fluorescent oasis. The harsh lights cut through the falling snow, creating a hazy glow that seemed almost otherworldly in the whiteout conditions. Calvin felt a wave of relief as he pulled up to the pump, the familiar routine offering a welcome distraction from his troubled thoughts. His movements were mechanical as he filled the tank, the cold biting at his exposed skin. Once the tank was full, he closed the petrol cap and made his way inside the station. The warmth hit him as soon as he opened the door, a stark contrast to the frigid air outside. He headed straight for the restroom, eager to splash some cold water on his face and clear his head. As he pushed open the restroom door, he heard two men's voices coming from inside. He was about to turn back when a fragment of their conversation caught his attention. "Did you see that girl in the pink dress standing by the road?" one man asked. "Yeah. Strange sight," the other replied. "Especially in this weather." Calvin froze, his hand still on the door handle. He listened intently as the conversation continued. "You didn't stop, did you?" the first man asked. "Nah," came the reply. "Weather's troubling enough without picking up strays. Probably just bring more trouble." The first man chuckled. "Smart move. For all we know, she could be some kind of lure. You hear stories, you know? Country cult or worse. Scam." Calvin's stomach churned at their callous words. He wanted to burst in to confront them about their indifference. But before he could move, the men's conversation shifted to other topics, and he heard them washing their hands. Quickly, Calvin stepped away from the door and busied himself at a nearby vending machine. The two men exited the restroom, barely sparing him a glance as they left the station. Once they were gone, Calvin entered the restroom. He splashed cold water on his face, but it did little to wash away the discomfort he felt. As he looked at his reflection in the mirror, he was troubled by how easily those men had dismissed a child in need. But then, a more uncomfortable thought struck him. Was he any better? He, too, had driven past the girl, leaving her alone in the cold. The realization sat heavy in his chest, a weight of guilt he couldn't shake off. Calvin dried his face, his movements slow and deliberate as he wrestled with his conscience. He had told himself he was just doing his job, that he couldn't get involved. But hearing those men and seeing his own actions reflected in their indifference made him question everything. With a heavy sigh, he left the restroom and went through his usual routine, paying for gas, ordering a cup of coffee, purchasing a cup noodle, and filling his thermos with hot water. The cashier, a bored-looking teenager, barely looked up from her phone as she rang up his purchases. Calvin found himself envying her apparent lack of concern for the world outside the station's walls. With his supplies in hand, Calvin returned to his truck. He settled into the driver's seat, the familiar smell of diesel and leather offering a small comfort. As he waited for his noodles to cook, he pulled out his phone and began scrolling through the news, more out of habit than any real interest. Suddenly, a headline stopped his scrolling. "Child found frozen on roadside." The words hit him like a physical blow, and suddenly the image of the girl in pink flooded back into his mind with startling clarity. As he read the tragic details of the child's death, the noodles turned tasteless in his mouth, guilt gnawing at his conscience. Calvin tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on the task at hand, but the more he tried to ignore it, the more insistent the memory became. He could see the girl's desperate face, feel the biting cold that must have been tormenting her thin frame. The warmth of the truck cab and his noodle cup suddenly felt oppressive, almost mocking in its comfort. Unable to shake the growing unease, Calvin quickly finished his meal. His hands shook slightly as he started the engine, his mind already calculating the route back. He tried to rationalize his decision. He would just check on the girl, return her to where she came from, make sure she was okay, or call the police to deal with her. He wouldn't linger long. Despite his boss's demands echoing in his head, despite the tight deadline and the consequences he might face, Calvin turned the truck around, heading back the way he came. As he pulled out of the station and back onto the snow-covered highway, Calvin couldn't help but wonder if he was making a huge mistake. But deep down, he knew that the real mistake had been driving past in the first place. Whatever consequences he might face, they couldn't be worse than the weight of guilt he'd carry if he didn't go back. With a deep breath, Calvin pressed down on the accelerator, his eyes scanning the road ahead. He only hoped he wasn't too late.